Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It's great to have you join us again as we plunge into another stack of sources you've sent our way.
Yeah, great to be back.
Today we're tackling a really foundational topic for any large democracy. How governance works, right at the local level, specifically in rural India.
That's right. We're diving into the world of Panchayati Raj. Think of it as India's system for rural local self-government.
Right.
It's not just an administrative structure. It's meant to be the very bedrock of democracy, reaching into villages and empowering communities with the explicit aim of driving development from the ground up.
And the material you've provided gives us a fantastic roadmap through this system's history, how it was conceived, the decades of debate, how it eventually got enshrined in the Constitution, and yes, the significant hurdles it still faces today.
So our mission today basically is to take these sources and really extract the key insights. We want to trace the fascinating journey of Panchayati Raj, dissect the constitutional framework established by that landmark 73rd Amendment and the Special PISA Act, understand the often tricky reality of its finances, and explore the documented reasons why, despite its constitutional mandate, its performance hasn't always, hit the mark.
Yeah.
As we uncover this story, what aspects of this journey resonate most with you? What jumps out?
Okay, let's unpack this long and winding road. The idea of local self-governance isn't exactly new, but after India's independence, there was a conscious effort to make it a driving force for rural change. Our sources point to some of the initial steps taken in the early 1950s.
Exactly. We saw programs like the Community Development Program in 1952
Right.
and the National Extension Service in 1953. These were ambitious initiatives, aimed at stimulating development in rural areas. They tried to involve people, but they also highlighted a fundamental challenge. Were they truly empowering local communities or, just delivering programs to them? There's a difference.
That's a key distinction. And recognizing that challenge led to a really pivotal moment in this history. In January 1957, the government decided they needed a serious look at how these programs were functioning and, maybe more importantly, how they could be improved to ensure genuine public participation.
Yeah, a real stocktake. This led to the appointment of the Balwantrai Mehta Committee. Their specific mandate was to examine the Community Development Program and the National Extension Service. Their report, delivered less than a year later in November 1957, didn't just suggest tweaks, it proposed a fundamental systemic change: democratic decentralization. This core concept is what gave birth to the term and the system we now know as Panchayati Raj.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This wasn't just some theoretical idea floating around. The Balwantrai Mehta Committee actually laid out a concrete blueprint for how this democratic decentralization should look on the ground. What were the key elements of their proposal?
Well, they envisioned a system built on a specific multi-tiered structure and a particular flow of authority. Their key recommendations included,
Go on.
1, a 3-tier system. This meant setting up local self-government bodies at 3 distinct levels. The Gram Panchayat at the village level, the Panchayat Samiti at the block level, that's like a collection of villages.
Right, the intermediate level.
Exactly. And the Zila Parishad at the district level.
Okay, 3 tiers.
2, they proposed these tiers should be organically linked. The connection between the levels would be established through indirect elections, creating a kind of chain of representation flowing upwards from the village.
Indirect elections.
Yes, interesting.
Yes, for the upper tiers. 3, while members of the village panchayats were to be directly elected by the villagers, putting power squarely in the hands of the local populace,
That makes sense.
members of the Panchayat Samiti and Zila Parishad would be indirectly elected from the tier immediately below them.
Okay, so direct at the bottom, indirect further up. Precisely. 4, they recommended that all planning and development activities for rural areas should be explicitly entrusted to these bodies. This was a significant shift, moving away from development being driven solely by government departments.
Giving them real work to do.
Exactly. 5, specific roles were assigned. The Panchayat Samiti, the block level, was seen as the executive body, responsible for actually implementing plans.
The doers.
Kind of, yeah. While the Zila Parishad at the district level would serve as the advisory, coordinating, and supervisory body.
Overseeing things.
Right. 6, they suggested the district collector should act as the chairman of the Zila Parishad. This was meant to integrate the administrative head with the elected body at the district level.
That's an interesting link between the bureaucracy and the elected body.
It is, and it's something that gets debated later on. 7. A core principle was the genuine transfer of power and responsibility. The committee really stressed this wasn't meant to be just a token gesture. Authority needed to genuinely shift downwards.
Not just lip service.
Exactly. 8, and this is absolutely crucial, they recognized that responsibility is pretty meaningless without resources. They insisted that adequate resources must be transferred to these bodies for them to perform their functions effectively.
Not money talk.
It's always. And finally, number 9, they recommended that a system should be evolved for future devolution of authority. They saw this as just a starting point, a dynamic process of transferring more power over time, not a one-off thing.
That's a really powerful vision, outlining not just that decentralization should happen, but how. Pretty comprehensive for 1957. And the National Development Council's acceptance in January 1958 was quick.
It was, yeah.
It's interesting that they gave states flexibility on the exact pattern, but required the basic principles to be the same. That adaptability was probably quite important for a country as diverse as India.
Absolutely. Allowing that flexibility enabled states to sort of pioneer the system in ways that suited them. Rajasthan was the first, famously inaugurated on October 2nd, 1959, in Nagaur district.
A historic day.
It was. Andhra Pradesh followed suit in the same year, 1959, and then most other states adopted a similar kind of structure in the years that followed.
But as states implemented it, that initial flexibility also led to quite a bit of variation by the mid-1960s. The sources you sent highlight how different states interpreted or modified the model.
Oh, definitely. You saw differences in the actual number of tiers. Rajasthan stuck to the recommended 3, but Tamil Nadu, for instance, opted for 2 tiers, and West Bengal actually experimented with 4 for a while.
4 tiers, wow.
Yeah. And the relative power distribution also varied quite a bit. In states like Rajasthan and Andhra Pradesh, the block-level Panchayat Samiti was the stronger entity, sort of the key unit for planning and execution.
Okay.
But in contrast, you had states like Maharashtra and Gujarat, where they gave the Zila Parishad, the district-level body, much more prominence and executive power.
So who held the real power differed state by state.
Exactly. And beyond just the structure, the tenure of these bodies, their composition, the specific functions they handled, and how finances were managed, all of these things also differed significantly from state to state. Some states even implemented Nyaya Panchayats.
What are those?
Separate bodies, basically, intended to handle minor judicial matters, like small disputes, at the village level. Though their effectiveness, well, that varied quite a bit, too.
Right. So this period of diverse implementation and, evolving challenges meant the system was under constant review, wasn't it? The source includes a table that's quite striking, just showing the sheer volume of study teams, committees, working groups appointed since the 1960s.
Long list.
The number alone tells you this wasn't a perfectly functioning system right out of the gate. There were persistent issues demanding attention, constantly being looked at.
Indeed. It reflects a continuous effort to diagnose problems and suggest improvements. After a phase where Panchayati Raj was perceived to be sort of declining or stagnating in many areas, the Janata government appointed the Ashok Mehta Committee in December 1977.
Okay. Another key committee.
Yes, and this one had an explicit mandate to revive and strengthen the system. It was seen as needing a shot in the arm.
They delivered a pretty comprehensive report in August 1978, didn't they? Something like 132 recommendations. That's a lot.
A hefty report, yes.
What were some of the most impactful proposals from the Ashok Mehta Committee? What really stands out?
Well, they made some pretty bold suggestions, actually. First, they proposed shifting from the 3 tiers recommended by Balwantrai Mehta to a 2-tier system.
Oh, really? Fewer tiers?
Yes. They suggested the Zila Parishad at the district level, and below it, something called the Mandal Panchayat, which would cover a cluster of villages with a population of about 15,000 to 20,000 people.
So grouping villages together more significantly at the lower level.
Right. They felt the district should be the first point of decentralization below the state level, and that the Zila Parishad should be the main executive body responsible for district-level planning.
Okay, strengthening the district level.
Exactly. A really notable recommendation, and one that sparked considerable debate then and later, was the official participation of political parties in all Panchayat elections.
Bringing party politics formally into local elections. I can see why that would be debated.
Definitely. To address the chronic financial weakness, they stressed that PIs, Panchayati Raj institutions, should have compulsory taxation powers to mobilize their own resources, not just relying on grants.
Making them raise their own funds.
Yes. They also proposed a system of regular social audit. This would be done by an agency at the district level and also a committee of state legislators, specifically looking at how funds meant for vulnerable sections were being used. Accountability.
Accountability, yeah, good idea.
And to prevent arbitrary actions by state governments, which was a big problem, they recommended that PRIs should not be superseded, dissolved easily. And if supersession was absolutely unavoidable, elections must be held within 6 months.
Protecting their term.
Exactly. For those judicial matters, they suggested Nyaya Panchayats should be kept separate from the development panchayats, and importantly, presided over by a qualified judge. Not just local elders.
Professionalizing the local justice aspect.
Trying to, yes. They also aimed for greater fairness and independence in elections, suggesting the state chief electoral officer, in consultation with the chief election commissioner of India, should organize and conduct the panchayat elections.
Taking it away from potentially biased local control.
Right. Development functions, they said, should be firmly transferred to the Zila Parishad, and the government staff working on these development functions should actually be placed under the Zila Parishad's control.
Making the Zila Parishad the real boss for local development.
That was the idea. They also recognized the role voluntary agencies could play in mobilizing public support for Panchayati Raj.
NGOs and such.
Yes. And to give the system political weight at the state level, they recommended appointing a dedicated minister for Panchayati Raj in the State Council of Ministers, someone responsible for it.
A champion within the state government.
Hopefully. Reservation for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes should be based on their population proportion, they affirmed. But perhaps their most crucial recommendation, the one that would gain significant traction over the next decade, was the need for constitutional recognition for PRIs.
There it is again.
Yes. They argued this was absolutely essential to give the system proper status, sanctity, stature, and importantly, an assurance of continuous functioning, protecting it from the political whims of state governments.
That push for constitutional status really stands out, doesn't it? It seems like a recurring theme. The source mentions that the collapse of the Janata government unfortunately prevented central action on the Ashok Mehta report.
Yeah, the timing wasn't great.
But it certainly influenced some states, didn't it? Karnataka, West Bengal, Andhra Pradesh. They took steps based on some of those recommendations. It showed the growing appetite for strengthening these bodies, even without central mandate yet.
Absolutely. Those states were kind of pioneers in adopting some of the reforms suggested. The debate and the committee work, well, it just kept going. In 1985, the Planning Commission appointed the GVK Rao Committee. Another one. This time specifically tasked with reviewing rural development and poverty alleviation programs and how PRIs fit into that picture.
And they came back with a conclusion that was quite damning and frankly pretty memorable, according to the source.
It really was. They found that the whole developmental process had become gradually bureaucratized and divorced from the Panchayati Raj, just completely separated.
Wow.
And they used this incredibly powerful phrase to describe the state of PRIs at the time. Grass without roots.
Grass without roots. That image immediately tells you the problem, doesn't it? Like, the elected bodies were just this superficial layer, completely unconnected to the actual implementation work being handled by government departments down below, leaving them pretty much ineffective.
Precisely. It implied they had no real foundation, no connection to the soil where things actually happen.
So what did the GVK Rao Committee propose to get those roots back, to revitalize the system?
Well, their recommendations really aimed to shift power back towards the PRIs, to make them central again. They argued that the Zila Parishad should be of pivotal importance. They emphasized that the district is the proper unit for planning and development, not smaller units or the state directly.
Focus on the district level again.
Yes, and the Zila Parishad should become the principal body for managing all development programs at that district level.
Okay.
PRIs at both the district and the lower levels should be assigned an important role in planning, implementation, and monitoring of rural development programs the whole cycle.
Right, involved throughout.
To facilitate this kind of effective decentralized planning, they suggested transferring some state-level planning functions down to district-level planning units working with the Zila Parishad.
Devolving planning itself.
Exactly. And to really operationalize the Zila Parishad's executive role, they recommended creating a new post, the District Development Commissioner. This person would serve as the chief executive officer of the Zila Parishad, like a CEO, and be in charge of all the development departments working at the district level.
A dedicated professional head for the Zila Parishad's work.
Yes. And recognizing a widespread problem that was undermining the whole system, they strongly recommended that elections to PRIs should be held regularly. They actually noted that elections were long overdue in 11 states at that time.
11 states. That shows how easily the system could be sidelined without constitutional protection.
It really does.
It's worth noting the contrast here, as the source points out, with some earlier committees, like Dantwala in 78 and Hanamantarao in 84. They also looked at district planning, but seemed more inclined to keep a strong role for the district collector in coordinating development.
That's an important distinction the source highlights, yeah. GBK Rao was different. They specifically recommended reducing the collector's developmental role and giving a major executive role to the PRIs, particularly the Zilla Parishad, led by their own chief executive, the proposed district development commissioner.
So a clear push towards PRI leadership in development, not just bureaucratic coordination.
Exactly. The momentum was building. Then, in 1986, the Rajiv Gandhi government appointed another committee, the LM Singhvi Committee.
Singhvi.
Their specific task was to prepare a concept paper on how to revitalize Panchayati Raj, framing it as essential for both democracy and development.
Linking the two goals explicitly.
Yes. And the LM Singhvi Committee strongly reinforced the call for constitutional status, adding significant weight to what the Ashok Mehta Committee had recommended almost a decade earlier.
So the constitutional idea is really gaining steam now.
Definitely. Their key proposals included, first and foremost, constitutional recognition. They felt PRIs needed to be constitutionally recognized, protected, and preserved. They even suggested adding a whole new chapter to the Constitution specifically for panchayats.
A dedicated chapter.
Yeah, to give them identity and integrity, making them reasonably immune from arbitrary actions by state governments. Constitutional provisions should also be included to ensure regular, free, and fair elections. That was seen as fundamental.
Non-negotiable elections.
Right. They also recommended establishing Naya Panchayats for clusters of villages, revisiting that idea.
Right.
And to make them more functional and viable, they suggested reorganizing villages, maybe merging smaller ones to create more effective Gram Panchayats.
Practical consolidation.
Sort of. They put a significant emphasis on the importance of the Gram Sabha, the village assembly. They called it the embodiment of direct democracy and really highlighted its potential role in participation and accountability.
Giving power to the people directly assembled.
That was the vision. Village panchayats, they said, should definitely be endowed with more financial resources. That financial weakness kept coming up.
Always the money.
And to handle disputes efficiently and fairly, disputes about elections, dissolution, other functioning matters, they proposed establishing judicial tribunals in each state specifically for Panchayati Raj issues.
Dedicated courts for PRI matters.
Essentially, yes. Taking it out of regular courts or administrative discretion.
Okay, so by this point, 1986, the idea of constitutionalizing Panchayati Raj was clearly a major focus, a central theme across different committees and political thinking. Then in 1988, we saw two more important reports contributing to this final push, the Thungan Committee and the Gadgil Committee.
Right, the final pieces falling into place almost.
The Thungan Committee was a parliamentary subcommittee looking at the district political and administrative structure specifically for planning purposes. What do they add?
The Thungan Committee, unsurprisingly perhaps, also strongly advocated for constitutional recognition. Their recommendations for strengthening PRIs really echoed and reinforced the consensus that was emerging. They included, again, explicit constitutional recognition. That was top of the list. Adopting a 3-tier system, village, block, district. Back to 3 tiers.
Okay, 3 tiers seem to be winning out.
It seems so. Positioning the Zilla Parishad as the pivot, the central point, acting as the primary planning and development agency in the district.
District focus again.
Yes. Mandating a fixed tenure of 5 years for all levels, limiting the period of supersession if a state government dissolved a panchayat to a maximum of 6 months, forcing elections quickly.
More security.
Establishing a state-level planning and coordination committee, chaired by the state planning minister, with the Zilla Parishad presidents as members. This was to better integrate district plans into the overall state planning process.
Linking district and state planning.
Exactly. Drawing up a detailed list of subjects or functions for Panchayati Raj and actually incorporating this list into the Constitution itself.
Putting the responsibilities right in the Constitution.
Yes. Implementing reservation of seats based on population for SCs and STs, and crucially, reservation for women in all 3 tiers. That was becoming a firm recommendation.
Gender representation.
Absolutely. Establishing a state finance commission in each state, that independent body, to recommend how funds should be shared between the state and the PRIs.
The financial watchdog.
Kind of. And interestingly, like the very first committee, Balwantrai Mehta, they suggested the district collector should be the chief executive officer of the Zila Parishad.
Back to the collector as CEO, contrasting with GVK Rao's idea. Shows the ongoing debate about that role.
It does. Different views on how to best manage the district level.
And finally, the Gaggill Committee in 1988. This was a Congress Party committee focused explicitly on policy questions around making PRIs effective.
Right. And the Gaggill Committee's recommendations were very much in sync with the prevailing ideas by this point. They served as a kind of final synthesis, really laying the groundwork for the actual constitutional amendment bill that followed. Their key points were bestowing constitutional status on PRIs. Number 1, adopting a 3-tier system, having a fixed term of 5 years.
Okay, consistent themes.
Very consistent. Mandating direct elections for members at all 3 levels. This was a notable point, differing from Balwantrai Mehta's initial proposal, which had indirect elections for the higher tiers. Gaggill recommended direct elections across the board.
More direct democracy at all levels.
That was the push. Providing reservation for SCs, STs, and women, assigning them clear responsibility for preparing and implementing socioeconomic development plans with that specific list of subjects included in the Constitution.
Functions clearly defined.
Empowering PRIs to levy, collect, and appropriate taxes and duties, giving them financial teeth. Establishing a state finance commission. And establishing a state election commission to conduct Panchayat elections independently.
Independent election body, independent finance body.
The whole package for autonomy and proper functioning.
So the Gaggill Committee's recommendations really consolidated all the key demands that had bubbled up over decades of reports, constitutional status, fixed term, direct elections at all levels, reservations, clear functions, and these independent financial and election bodies. And the source notes the critical significance here. These recommendations became the direct basis for drafting the amendment bill that aimed to finally grant Panchayati Raj constitutional status and protection.
Exactly. Which brings us, finally, to the major turning point in this whole long story. The process of constitutionalization itself, culminating in the 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act of 1992.
And getting there wasn't just a single smooth step, was it? The sources recount the efforts by different governments, the political back and forth.
No, it was quite a political journey. The Rajiv Gandhi government made the first significant attempt. They introduced the 64th Constitutional Amendment Bill in July 1989. It actually passed the Lok Sabha, the lower house. But it faced strong opposition and ultimately failed to pass in the Rajya Sabha, the upper house. There were concerns raised, particularly by opposition parties, that the bill, as drafted, might actually lead to excessive centralization, potentially weakening the state's role in India's federal structure?
That's a really interesting point, an attempt, ostensibly, to empower local bodies being seen by some as potentially weakening states in relation to the central government. It really highlights the delicate balance in India's federalism, doesn't it?
Precisely. It's always a balancing act. Following that setback, the VP Singh government, which came to power in late 1989, also signaled its intent to strengthen PRIs. They held a conference of chief ministers to build consensus and introduced their own constitutional amendment bill in September 1990.
Round two.
However, this bill also lapsed because the government fell shortly thereafter. Politics intervened again.
So the political will seemed to be there across different governments, but the path to getting the consensus and the successful legislation was proving pretty difficult.
It was tricky. Finally, when the Narasimha Rao government took office in 1991, they revisited the proposal. They basically took the previous bills, looked at why they failed, and drastically modified some of the more controversial aspects that had caused concern among the states and opposition. They introduced a revised, hopefully more consensus-based constitutional amendment bill in September 1991.
Third time lucky.
Third time lucky indeed. This third attempt was the one that succeeded. It navigated its way through Parliament and emerged as the 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act, 1992. It received the President's assent in April 1993 and officially came into force across the country on April 24th, 1993.
April 24th, 1993. That date is absolutely a landmark moment in Indian democracy, isn't it?
It fundamentally reshaped the landscape of local governance in India. The act added a whole new section to the Constitution, Part 9, titled the Panchayats.
Part 9.
Yes, covering Articles 243 right through to 243.0, and it also added the 11th Schedule to the Constitution.
The 11th.
Which contains a list of 29 distinct functional items, subjects like agriculture, health, education, sanitation, that were intended to be devolved to the panchayats.
So it's not just a short amendment. It's a really detailed constitutional chapter defining the structure and the potential scope of these local bodies.
Exactly. The significance is immense. For one thing, it gave practical shape to Article 40 of the Directive Principles of State Policy.
Ah, Article 40. That was one that said states should organize village panchayats.
Right. It had long called for states to organize village panchayats and enable them to function as units of self-government. But critically, before the 73rd Amendment, Article 40 was just an aspirational guideline, part of the non-justiciable directive principles.
Meaning you couldn't actually go to court and force a state government to set up functional panchayats based on Article 40 alone. It was more like advice.
Correct. By bringing Panchayati Raj under Part 9, which is a justiciable part of the Constitution, the Act created a constitutional obligation for all state governments to establish this three-tier system and ensure its regular functioning through elections.
A legal requirement now?
Absolutely. The formation of panchayats and the holding of regular periodic elections no longer depended merely on the will of the state government, which had been a major weakness previously, allowing states to postpone elections for years sometimes.
That's a massive shift from something a state might do or should do to something it constitutionally must do.
Precisely. The source rightly calls it a significant landmark. It highlights its role in transforming what was primarily a representative democracy, where you elect people to represent you far away, into potentially a participatory democracy, involving people directly in governance closer to home. A truly revolutionary concept, the source says, for deepening self-governance at the village, block, and district levels.
Okay, let's really unpack the salient features of this landmark act then. What are the core elements that the 73rd Amendment now mandates across India? What did it actually put into the Constitution?
Right. The Act lays down a number of compulsory or mandatory provisions that states must implement. Alongside those, there are some voluntary or discretionary ones they may adopt. Let's start with the core mandatory features, the things every state has to do.
The non-negotiables.
Exactly. First, the Gram Sabha. The Act mandates the establishment of a Gram Sabha as the absolute foundation of the Panchayati Raj system.
The village assembly.
Yes, and it's not just an abstract concept. It's defined as a body consisting of all persons registered in the electoral rolls of a village within the area of the Panchayat at the village level. It's effectively the village assembly of all registered voters.
So direct democracy embodied.
In principle, yes. The specific powers and functions of the Gram Sabha are actually left to be determined by the state legislature. That's a key detail. But its existence as a body is compulsory.
Okay, it must exist, but states decide what it does.
Pretty much. Second, it mandates a three-tier system of panchayats across the country at the village, intermediate or block, and district levels. This was aimed at bringing structural uniformity.
3 tiers everywhere.
With one exception. States with a population not exceeding 20 lakh or 2 million people are given the option not to constitute the panchayat at the intermediate block level. Small states can have just 2 tiers.
Ah, okay, some flexibility for smaller states.
Third, it specifies the election of members and chairpersons. All members at all 3 levels, village, intermediate, and district, must be directly elected by the people residing in the respective panchayat areas.
Direct election for all members. That's different from Balwant Rai Mehta's idea for the upper tiers.
It is, yes. This was a key change reflecting the Gadgil Committee recommendations. However, the chairpersons at the intermediate and district levels are elected indirectly by and from among the elected members of that panchayat.
Okay, indirect election for the chairs of the top 2 tiers.
Right. But the method of electing the village chairperson, the sarpanch or pradhan, is left to the state legislature's discretion. Some states have direct election, others indirect. Critically, all elected members and chairpersons have voting rights in the meetings of their respective panchayats.
Got it. What about representation?
Fourth, and this is a major feature, is the reservation of seats. The Act mandates the proportional reservation of seats for scheduled castes, SCs, and scheduled tribes, STs, at all 3 levels.
Okay.
This applies both for membership seats and for the offices of chairpersons, based on their population proportion in that respective panchayat area.
Proportional representation for SEs and STs.
Yes. Going further, it mandates that not less than 1/3 of the total number of seats at all three levels must be reserved for women.
1/3 for women. That's significant.
It is. And this reservation for women includes the seats already reserved for SC and ST women. Additionally, not less than 1/3 of the total number of chairperson offices at each level must also be reserved for women.
So reservation for women as members and as leaders.
Correct. The Act also says state legislatures may provide for reservation for backward classes, OBCs, but making that provision is voluntary, not mandatory, like for SC/ST and women.
Okay, OBC reservation is optional for states.
Right. The SC/ST reservation is linked to Article 334 of the Constitution, which deals with time limits for reservations currently extended up to 2030. The source also notes an interesting exception brought in by the 83rd Amendment in 2000 for the state of Arunachal Pradesh.
What's that?
It exempts Arunachal Pradesh from reserving seats for scheduled castes in its panchayats because the state is overwhelmingly tribal and has historically had negligible SC population.
Ah, a specific adaptation for local demographics. Makes sense.
Fifth, the duration of panchayats is fixed at a uniform 5-year term for all levels, starting from the date appointed for its first meeting. This provides stability and predictability.
5 years. Standard term.
Yes. And if a panchayat is dissolved by the state government before the completion of its 5-year term, the Act mandates that fresh elections must be completed within 6 months from the date of dissolution.
Quick elections if dissolved.
Yes. No long periods of administrative rule allowed. There's a small exception. If the remaining period of the dissolved panchayat's term is less than 6 months, then an election to constitute the panchayat for that short remaining period is not mandatory.
Okay, practical exception.
And importantly, a panchayat that's reconstituted after being dissolved prematurely doesn't get a fresh 5-year term. It only serves for the remainder of the period for which the dissolved panchayat would have continued.
Right. Keeps the election cycles aligned. Sixth point.
Sixth, the Act specifies grounds for disqualifications for membership. Generally, a person can be disqualified based on the same grounds applicable for elections to the state legislature or under any specific law made by the state legislature regarding panchayat elections.
So similar rules as for state MLAs.
Broadly, yes. But there's an important point regarding age. A person is not disqualified for being under 25 years old if they have attained the age of 21. So the minimum age for contesting panchayat elections is 21.
Lower age limit, 21. Good for youth participation.
Potentially, yes. Any questions about whether a member has become subject to disqualification are referred to an authority specified by the state legislature.
Okay. What about conducting the elections?
Seventh, a huge one. The Act mandates the establishment of a state election commission, SEC, in every single state.
Independent election body just for panchayats.
And municipalities, too, under the 74th Amendment. This SEC is vested with the superintendent's direction, control, and responsibility for preparing the electoral rolls and conducting all elections to the panchayats in the state.
So taking it away from the regular state government machinery.
Precisely, to ensure independence and fairness. The state election commissioner is appointed by the state governor, but crucially, their conditions of service and the process for their removal are given the same protection as a judge of a state high court.
Same protection as a high court judge. Wow.
Yes. This means they can only be removed from office by the President of India on the recommendation of Parliament, following a process similar to impeachment. They can't just be fired by the state government.
That provides significant independence, doesn't it?
It's designed to. Their service conditions also cannot be changed to their disadvantage after they have been appointed. While state legislatures can still make laws regarding various election matters, the actual conduct of elections is firmly with the independent SEC.
Okay, that's a strong pillar. What about the money side?
Eighth, and equally important, is the mandatory creation of a state finance commission, SFC. The state governor shall constitute an SFC every 5 years.
Every 5 years, like the Central Finance Commission.
Exactly. This commission's primary role is to review the financial position of the panchayats in the state. It then makes recommendations to the governor on several key financial matters.
Such as
the principles that should govern the distribution of the net proceeds of state taxes, duties, tolls, and fees between the state and the panchayats. Also, how the panchayat's share should be allocated among the different levels of panchayats, village, intermediate, district.
how to divide the pie.
Yes. Also, determining which taxes, duties, tolls, and fees can be assigned to or appropriated by the panchayats themselves. Measures for providing grants and aid from the State Consolidated Fund to the PRIs. Steps needed to improve the overall financial position of the PRIs. And any other financial matter referred to it by the governor for the sake of sound finances.
A broad mandate for financial health.
Very broad. The state legislature determines the composition of the SFC, qualifications, and selection process. The governor is then constitutionally required to place the SFC's recommendations, along with a report on the action taken by the government on those recommendations before the state legislature.
So transparency on whether the state accepts the advice.
Supposedly. Furthermore, the Central Finance Commission, the one constituted under Article 280 for center state finances, is also mandated by the Constitution now to suggest measures needed to augment the consolidated fund of a state to supplement the resources of the panchayats in that state. But it does so based on the recommendations made by the respective state SFC.
So the state SFC's work feeds into central funding decisions for panchayats too. Interesting link.
It connects the dots, yes. Ninth point.
Go on.
Ninth, regarding powers and functions. The Act enables the state legislature to endow panchayats with such powers and authority as may be necessary to enable them to function as institutions of self-government.
Okay, enable them.
Yes, note the word may implicitly there. The scheme of devolution may contain provisions for the devolution of powers and responsibilities related to two key areas. First, preparing plans for economic development and social justice, and second, implementing schemes for economic development and social justice.
Planning and implementation.
Right, including potentially those related to the 29 specific items listed in that 11th schedule we mentioned earlier. But the crucial thing here is that the extent of this functional devolution, which of the 29 functions, and how much power over them is left to the discretion of the state legislature. It's voluntary for states.
So the Constitution enables it, but doesn't mandate the full transfer of all 29 functions. That's a key voluntary aspect.
A very key distinction. 10th, concerning finances, it's a similar story. The state legislature may authorize panchayats to levy, collect, and appropriate specific local taxes, duties, tolls, and fees. They may also assign certain state levy taxes or provide grants and aid from the State Consolidated Fund. They may also provide for the constitution of dedicated funds for the panchayats.
Again, may. So the actual devolution of significant financial powers is also voluntary, left to the states.
Correct. The mandatory part is setting up the State Finance Commission to recommend things. The actual giving of taxing powers or untied funds is discretionary for the state legislation.
That feels like a potential weakness, doesn't it? Structure is mandated, but the power and money might not follow.
It's certainly where a lot of the challenges arise, as we'll see. 11th, audit of accounts. State legislatures may make provisions for the maintenance and auditing of the accounts of the panchayats. Again, a may.
Okay.
12th, application to union territories. The Act generally applies to union territories, but the President of India has the power to direct that it applies with certain exceptions or modifications.
Okay, adaptable for UTs. 13th, exemptions.
13th, exempted states and areas. As we touched on briefly before, the Act explicitly states that its provisions do not apply automatically to 3 states: Nagaland, Meghalaya, and Mizoram.
Why those 3?
Primarily due to their unique tribal governance structures and existing constitutional arrangements, often under the 6th Schedule. The Act also does not automatically apply to the scheduled areas under the 5th Schedule and tribal areas under the 6th Schedule within other states.
So tribal areas generally exempt initially?
Yes. The source lists the states with 5th Schedule areas where this exemption initially applied, places like Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Chhattisgarh, Gujarat, Himachal Pradesh, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Odisha, and Rajasthan. It also mentions the 6th Schedule tribal areas in Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura, and Mizoram. And it specifically exempts the hill areas of Manipur, which had district councils, and the Darjeeling district of West Bengal, which had the Darjeeling Gorkha Hill Council.
A lot of specific exemptions.
Yes, reflecting the complexity of governance in these specific regions. However, the Act did empower Parliament to extend the provisions of Part 9 to the scheduled and tribal areas, subject to such exceptions and modifications as Parliament might specify.
And that's the power Parliament used to enact the PISA Act later.
Exactly. That provision was the constitutional basis for the PISA Act of 1996, which extended Panchayati Raj to the 5th Schedule areas with modifications.
Got it. 14th point.
14th, continuance of existing laws. To allow states time to transition and amend their own panchayat laws to conform to the 73rd Amendment, state laws relating to panchayats that were in force immediately before the commencement of the act were allowed to continue for 1 year from the act's commencement, so until April 24, 1994.
A 1-year grace period.
Yes, and existing panchayats that were functioning at the time also continued until the expire of their term unless they were dissolved earlier by a resolution passed by the state legislature.
Okay, smooth transition planned. And the last one, 15th.
15th, a bar to interference by courts in certain electoral matters. The act includes a provision stating that the validity of any law relating to the delimitation of constituencies or the allotment of seats to those constituencies cannot be called into question in any court.
Keeping delimitation disputes out of courts.
Yes. Furthermore, it states that an election to any panchayat can only be questioned by presenting an election petition to such authority and in such manner as is specified by the state legislature. You can't just file a regular court case to challenge an election result. You have to follow the specific election petition process laid down by the state.
Okay, specific channels for election disputes. That's a comprehensive list of features laying out the whole blueprint. And that 11 schedule, with its list of 29 functional items, could you quickly give us a flavor of what's on that list, just to get a sense of the scope envisioned for panchayats?
Sure. It's quite broad, covering the essentials of rural life. It includes things like agriculture, including agricultural extension, land improvement, implementation of land reforms, land consolidation, and soil conservation, minor irrigation, water management, and watershed development, animal husbandry, dairying, and poultry, fisheries, social forestry and farm forestry, minor forest produce, small-scale industries, including food processing industries, khadi, village and cottage industries, rural housing, drinking water, fuel and fodder, roads, culverts, bridges, ferries, waterways, and other means of communication, rural electrification, including distribution of electricity, non-conventional energy sources, the poverty alleviation program, education, including primary and secondary schools, technical training and vocational education, adult and non-formal education, libraries, cultural activities, markets and fairs, health and sanitation, including hospitals, primary health centers, and dispensaries, family welfare, women and child development, social welfare, including welfare of the handicapped and mentally retarded, welfare of the weaker sections, and in particular of the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, the public distribution system, and finally, maintenance of community assets.
Wow. That really is meant to cover the waterfront of rural life and development, isn't it? From agriculture and infrastructure to education, health, and social welfare.
It is. It represents a potential transfer of responsibility for almost every significant aspect of rural development and well-being. But, and this is crucial as the source clearly distinguishes, we absolutely have to remember the difference between the compulsory and the voluntary provisions of the 73rd Amendment Act.
Right. You mentioned this earlier. The compulsory ones are the non-negotiables, the structural and procedural safeguards, the basic foundation that must be put in place by every state.
Exactly. These are the things states have to include in their panchayat laws. They include the mandatory organization of gram sabhas at the village level, the 3-tier setup, village intermediate district, with that population exception for the intermediate tier in small states, the direct elections for all seats at all levels, the indirect elections for the chairpersons at the intermediate and district levels, the voting rights for all members and chairpersons, the minimum age of 21 for contesting elections, the non-negotiable reservation rules for SEs, STs, proportional to population, and women, at least 1/3, covering both member seats and chairperson offices, the fixed 5-year tenure and the 6-month rule for holding fresh elections if a panchayat is dissolved early, and the mandatory establishment of the Independent State Election Commission to conduct elections and the State Finance Commission to review finances and make recommendations. These are the elements that provide the system with its constitutional anchor, ensuring its existence, regular electoral process, and basic representation structure across the country.
Okay, those are the mandatory structural pillars. And the voluntary provisions, then, are where the real action is, where the rubber meets the road in terms of actual power and day-to-day autonomy. These are the areas where states can choose to devolve more or less power based on their own assessment or, frankly, their political will.
Precisely. These are the discretionary parts where states have choices. They include things like defining the specific powers and functions of the Gram Sabha beyond its basic existence. How much real say does the village assembly get? The manner of electing the village chairperson, direct or indirect. whether to provide representation for chairpersons of lower tiers in the higher tiers, or whether to include MPs and MLAs as members in Panchayat bodies, with or without voting rights, whether or not to provide reservation for backward classes, OBCs, and most importantly, these voluntary provisions include the degree to which states actually grant panchayats the powers and authority necessary for them to function as truly autonomous institutions of self-government.
To how much real independence they get.
Exactly. It includes the actual devolution of planning and implementation responsibilities for those 29 functions listed in the 11th schedule, which functions get transferred, and how much control goes with them. It also covers the extent of financial powers granted, like authorizing panchayats to levy, collect, and appropriate specific taxes, assigning state taxes to them, providing untied grants and aid, and allowing them to constitute and manage their own funds.
That distinction is absolutely key, isn't it? So the basic structure, the elections, the reservations, the finance commission, those are constitutionally guaranteed. But the actual ability of a panchayat to act independently as a unit of self-governance, to raise its own money for its own priorities, and to implement its own plans for those 29 crucial development areas, that's largely left to the discretion of the state government.
That's the crux of it.
This distinction really foreshadows some of the major challenges and criticisms of how Panchayati Raj has worked in practice, which I imagine we'll discuss later.
It certainly does. It sets the stage for understanding why performance varies so much and why there are often complaints about lack of real power. Now, building on that, let's move to a specific context that required a special modified approach. The scheduled areas, which, as we noted, were initially exempted from the main 73rd Amendment Act.
Yes, the source made it clear that the act didn't automatically apply to those areas listed in the 5th schedule of the Constitution, primarily areas with significant tribal populations and distinct cultural contexts. But Parliament had been given the power to extend the provisions later with changes.
Correct. And Parliament exercised that power by enacting the provisions of the Panchayats, Extension to the Scheduled Areas Act of 1996. It's widely known just as PISA.
PISA, 1996.
Yes. Using its power under the 73rd Amendment itself, Parliament extended the provisions of Part 9's, the Panchayats, to the 5th Schedule areas. But importantly, it did so with significant modifications, tailored specifically to the unique context of tribal societies, their traditions, and their customary governance systems.
So not just applying the same rules, but adapting them.
Very much adapting them. The source lists the 10 states that currently have 5th schedule areas where PISA applies, states like Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Chhattisgarh, Gujarat, Himachal Pradesh, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Odisha, and Rajasthan. All these states were then required by PISA to enact their own state-level compliance legislation, amending their existing Panchayat Acts to incorporate the specific features of PISA for their scheduled areas.
Right. So PISA wasn't just a simple copy-paste extension. It seems to have had a very distinct philosophy behind it, really focused on tribal self-rule and respecting tradition. What were the core objectives driving this specific act? Why was it needed?
PISA's objectives were quite different, or perhaps more emphasized, compared to the general 73rd Amendment. They were centered squarely on empowering tribal communities and ensuring their indigenous ways of life and governance were respected and integrated. The sources highlight several key goals. Firstly, obviously, to extend the provisions of Part 9's to scheduled areas, but with crucial modifications that explicitly respected local tribal laws and practices. Secondly, to provide genuine self-rule for the significant tribal populations residing in these areas. This was framed as going beyond mere local administration. It was about restoring a degree of autonomy.
Self-rule, not just self-government.
A subtle but important distinction, perhaps. Thirdly, to achieve genuine village governance based on participatory democracy, making the Gram Sabha the absolute nucleus of all activities and decision-making, even more central than in the General Act.
Putting the village assembly right at the heart.
Absolutely. Fourthly, to evolve an administrative framework in these areas that was deliberately consistent with traditional practices and customary modes of tribal society.
Working with tradition, not against it.
Fifthly, to actively safeguard and preserve the traditions and customs of tribal communities, their cultural identity, and importantly, their traditional rights over community resources.
Protecting culture and resources.
Sixthly, To empower panchayats at the appropriate levels, village, maybe intermediate, within scheduled areas with specific powers that were particularly conducive to the unique requirements and context of tribal areas, things like control over land, forests, minerals, etc.
Powers relevant to their lives.
Exactly. And seventhly, and this is crucial for understanding Pisa's philosophy, to explicitly prevent higher-level panchayats, like block or district panchayats, from assuming the powers and authority that rightfully belong to lower-level panchayats, or, most importantly, the Gram Sabha itself.
So guarding the power of the village level.
Yes. It deliberately tried to invert the typical top-down flow of power often seen, ensuring the village assembly remained paramount in scheduled areas.
That focus on the Gram Sabha as the nucleus and explicitly preventing higher tiers from overriding the village, that's a very strong statement about where authority should lie in these specific areas, isn't it?
It is. It reflects a different vision of decentralization for these communities.
So what were some of the specific provisions written into the PISA Act that actually embodied these objectives? How did it differ in practice from the main 73rd Amendment?
PISA included several key features that clearly differentiated its application in scheduled areas. First, it mandated that any state legislation relating to panchayats in scheduled areas must be in consonance with customary law, social and religious practices, and traditional management practices of community resources. This legally enshrined the importance of tribal traditions and customary law as a filter for state laws.
Customary law gets legal backing.
Yes. Second, that the very definition of a village under PISA isn't just an administrative boundary. It's supposed to be based on a community and its traditions and customs, often comprising a habitation or a group of habitations managing affairs according to tradition.
Community-defined villages.
Third, a Gram Sabha is mandatory in every such village, consisting of all the adults whose names are in the electoral rolls for that village panchayat area.
Okay.
Fourth, the Gram Sabha is explicitly stated in PESA as being competent to safeguard and preserve the traditions and customs of the people, their cultural identity, their community resources, and their traditional methods of dispute resolution. It's given a guardianship role.
Guardian of tradition and resources.
Fifth, and this is huge, the Gram Sabha must approve all development plans, programs, and projects before they can be implemented by the village panchayat. The panchayat cannot act without the Gram Sabha's prior approval on development initiatives.
Wow, so the community gets a direct veto or approval power over development projects.
Exactly. It gives the community direct control. Sixth, the Gram Sabha is also responsible for identifying beneficiaries under poverty alleviation and other government programs, not just the panchayat or officials deciding who gets benefits.
Community identifies beneficiaries.
Yes. Seventh, the village panchayat is required to obtain a certification from the Gram Sabha stating that it has properly utilized the funds allocated for the development programs implemented in the village. This makes the panchayat directly accountable to the village assembly for expenditure.
Accountability through certification.
Right. Eighth, regarding reservation. While proportional reservation for SCS applies as per the 73rd Amendment, PISA adds a crucial layer. The reservation for scheduled tribes, STs, cannot be less than 50% of the total number of seats in any panchayat at any level in a scheduled area.
Minimum 50% seats for STs.
Yes. And even more significantly, PISA mandates that all the offices of chairpersons of panchayats at all levels, village, intermediate, district, in scheduled areas, must be reserved for persons belonging to the scheduled tribes.
All chairperson posts reserved for STs. That ensures tribal leadership.
It does. State governments may nominate members from ST communities that don't have representation in intermediate or district panchayats, but this nomination power is limited to a maximum of 1/10 of the total elected members in that panchayat.
Limited nomination power.
Ninth, for critical matters like land acquisition for development projects or the planning and implementation of resettlement and rehabilitation of people affected by projects in scheduled areas, consultation with the Gram Sabha or the appropriate panchayat level is mandatory before any acquisition or displacement takes place. While state-level agencies might coordinate the actual planning and implementation, the local consultation is a required first step.
Mandatory consultation on land acquisition and displacement.
Yes. 10th, the planning and management of minor water bodies in the scheduled areas is specifically entrusted to the appropriate level of panchayats as determined by the state legislature.
Local control over water bodies.
11th, the source highlights PISA's significant provisions regarding minor minerals. The recommendation of the Gram Sabha or the appropriate Panchayat level is mandatory before a prospecting license or a mining lease for any minor mineral can be granted in scheduled areas.
Mandatory recommendation for mining leases.
Yes. Furthermore, their prior recommendation is also mandatory before any concession for the exploitation of minor minerals by auction can be granted. This gives tribal communities a significant say, if not outright control, over the extraction of valuable local mineral resources.
Control over minor minerals. That's economically important. Very. 12th, state legislatures, when they're endowing powers of self-government to panchayats in scheduled areas, must specifically ensure that the Gram Sabha or the panchayats at the appropriate level are endowed with certain specific powers. These include the power to enforce prohibition or regulate the sale and consumption of intoxicants, the power of ownership of minor forest produce, like tendu leaves, bamboo, etc., which are critical for tribal livelihoods, the power to prevent land alienation, the illegal transfer of tribal land to non-tribals, and to take action to restore unlawfully alienated land, the power to manage village markets, the power to exercise control over money lending to scheduled tribes to prevent exploitation, the power to exercise control over institutions and functionaries working in the social sectors, like schools, health centers, and the power to exercise control over local plans and the resources for those plans, including specific tribal subplans funded by the government. Wow, that's a powerful list of specific controls. Liquor, forest produce, land, markets, money lending, social sector functionaries, local plans.
It's meant to give them real levers of control over their socioeconomic environment. 13th, state legislation under PISA must also include specific safeguards to prevent higher-level panchayats, block or district, from assuming the powers and authority that have been assigned to lower-level panchayats, or, crucially, the Gram Sabha, reinforcing that bottom-up principle.
Protecting the lower tier's autonomy.
14th, state legislatures should endeavor. It's a recommendation, not a strict mandate, to follow the pattern of administration that exists under the 6th schedule, which applies to autonomous district councils in some northeastern states when designing the administrative structure at the district level in the scheduled areas covered by PISA.
Suggesting alignment with the 6th schedule model for district administration.
Yes. And finally, any state law relating to panchayats in scheduled areas that was inconsistent with the provisions of PISA automatically ceased to be enforced 1 year after PISA received presidential assent, which was December 24th, 1996, so they had until December 24th, 1997 to comply. Existing panchayats continued until their term expired or were dissolved.
Okay, so PISA really represents a quite distinct, arguably more radical form of decentralization and self-governance, specifically tailored for tribal areas. It places immense power and responsibility, at least on paper, with the Gram Sabha, and mandates respect for traditional laws, customs, and resource management practices.
That's a fair summary. It's designed to empower the community assembly and safeguard tribal rights in a way that the General 73rd Amendment, while significant, perhaps doesn't achieve to the same degree in non-scheduled areas.
That's a really fascinating adaptation of the general framework for a specific sensitive context. It emphasizes community control in a way that seems even stronger than the main 73rd Amendment might typically play out in practice elsewhere. Okay, let's shift gears now to another absolutely critical dimension for any governing body anywhere in the world. Finances, money matters.
Always does.
The source includes insights from the Second Administrative Reforms Commission, ARC, which looked closely at Panchayati Raj between 2005 and 2009. What was their main takeaway on finances?
The Commission made a very clear and fundamental point. While the 73rd Amendment in Part 9X provided the essential structural framework and the constitutional backing for PRIs, their true strength, their actual effectiveness, and their genuine autonomy are heavily dependent on their financial position.
Makes sense.
This includes not just the funds they receive from above, but critically their own capacity for own resource generation. Having the legal status, the elected body, is one thing, but without adequate, predictable, and ideally self-generated finances, they simply can't function effectively as institutions of self-government. The structure remains hollow without financial muscle.
Right. Power without purse strings isn't really power. So according to the source material from the ARC and elsewhere, what are the main pipelines through which revenue is supposed to flow to Panchayati Raj institutions? Where does the money come from, theoretically?
The source lists 5 primary sources or channels of revenue for PRIs. 1. Grants from the union government. These are funds transferred from the central government, typically based on the recommendations made by the Central Finance Commission, the Article 280 body, which suggests how central resources should be shared. 2. Devolution from the state government. This is meant to be a crucial source. Funds transferred from the state government to PRIs based on the recommendations of the State Finance Commission, the Article 243 body that we discussed earlier, which is supposed to recommend the formula for sharing state revenues every 5 years.
Okay, central grants and state devolution.
3. Loans or grants directly from the state government. This could be financial assistance provided by the state outside the formal SFC devolution process, perhaps for specific purposes or as general support. 4. Program-specific allocation. These are funds provided, often by the central government but routed through the state, under specific centrally sponsored schemes, CSS, or other programs like additional central assistance. These funds are usually earmarked for particular development projects or initiatives like building roads under a certain scheme or implementing a specific health program.
Side funds, basically.
Often, yes. And 5, internal resource generation, IRG. This is the revenue raised by the panchayats themselves directly from their local jurisdiction. Through various tax and non-tax sources, they are empowered to levy and collect.
Okay, those 5 streams. So what picture did the Administrative Reforms Commission's study actually paint regarding the overall financial health and economy of PRIs across the country? Was this theoretical framework translating into strong financial standing on the ground?
Well, the conclusions presented in the source, based on the ARC's findings, were pretty sobering and pointed to significant and persistent challenges in the financial domain.
Not surprising, perhaps, given our earlier discussion on voluntary financial powers.
Indeed. First, internal resource generation is generally weak. The source notes that panchayats, particularly at the village, Gram Panchayat level, where the potential is theoretically highest, struggle to generate significant revenue internally.
Why is that?
It's attributed partly to a thin tax domain, meaning the range of taxes they are actually empowered by state laws to levy is often quite limited. But also, quite tellingly, it's partly due to the PRI's own reluctance to actually impose and collect taxes from their own constituents.
Ah, the political difficulty of taxing your neighbors.
Exactly. Second, as a consequence, PRIs are heavily dependent on grants coming down from the union and state governments. They function more as recipients of funds decided elsewhere, rather than as financially autonomous bodies generating their own revenue. This dependence naturally limits their autonomy.
Relying on handouts, essentially.
To a large extent, yes. Third, a major portion of these grants, especially the large sums flowing through central schemes, CSS, is scheme-specific or tied. This is identified as a major limitation.
Why specifically?
Because it leaves panchayats with limited discretion and flexibility in spending. They receive funds with strict guidelines on what they must be spent on, which specific activities, often with detailed rules set by ministries in Delhi or the state capital. This means they can't easily allocate funds based on the most pressing needs identified locally by the community through the Gram Sabha process. The money might be there, but not for what the village actually wants or needs most.
So, local priorities get overridden by national or state scheme priorities.
Often, yes. Fourth, the source notes that many state governments are perceived as not keen to devolve funds adequately to PRIs, even the untied funds recommended by their own state finance commissions. They often cite their own tight fiscal positions and budget constraints as a reason for holding back funds or devolving less than recommended.
States feeling the pinch themselves.
That's the argument often used. Fifth, the source points out that in many critical areas listed in that 11th schedule, the very functions supposedly meant for panchayats, like primary education, primary health care, local water supply, village sanitation, minor irrigation works. The reality in many states is that the state government departments are still directly responsible for implementation and expenditure. The function hasn't truly been devolved along with the necessary funds and staff. The panchayat might have a nominal role, but the State Department still runs the show.
So, responsibility listed in the Constitution, but not matched by reality on the ground.
Exactly. The overall result, as the ARC found and the source summarizes, is a situation where panchayats have been given significant responsibility on paper, but are left with grossly inadequate resources, both financial and functional, to fulfill those responsibilities effectively.
That sounds like the very definition of being set up to fail, doesn't it? You're given the task, maybe even the legal mandate, but not the actual tools, the money, the staff, the authority to do the job properly.
It's a major structural impediment.
That point about tied funds is particularly frustrating when you think about the promise of decentralization, isn't it? You have a local elected body, presumably best placed to know the community's unique priorities and needs, but most of their money comes with strings attached, dictating priorities from higher levels of government.
Exactly. It fundamentally undermines the very idea of local planning and responsive self-governance. And the source strongly emphasizes why own resource generation, IRG, is considered so important, calling it the soul behind its financial standing.
The soul. Why such strong language?
Because it's not just about the quantum of money raised locally, which might be small initially. The act of establishing and running a local taxation system inherently ensures people's involvement and, critically, makes the institution accountable to its citizens. When people pay local taxes, even small amounts, they feel a direct stake in how that money is spent. They are more likely to attend Gram Sabas, ask questions, demand transparency, and hold their elected local representatives accountable for performance.
So local taxes create local accountability. Makes sense.
Mhm.
If it's just government money from afar, people might feel less entitled to scrutinize it.
Precisely. It changes the relationship between the citizen and the local government.
Which tier of the Panchayati Raj system, according to the source, is generally in a better position, at least potentially, to generate its own revenue?
The Gram Panchayats, right at the village level, are generally considered comparatively better off in terms of having a defined tax domain of their own. State laws typically grant them the power to levy a wider range of local taxes compared to the higher tiers.
And the intermediate block and district panchayats.
Their scope for independent taxation is usually much more limited. They might rely more on secondary sources like tolls, fees for services, rent from properties, and non-tax revenue, rather than having broad taxation powers like the Gram Panchayat potentially does.
Okay. Can you give us a few examples of the types of taxes and fees that the source mentions typically fall under the potential jurisdiction of village panchayats? What could they be collecting?
Sure. The source lists various examples that state legislatures often empower Gram Panchayats to levy, although the actual list and rates vary state by state. These commonly include property tax or house tax, profession tax on people working within the village, a general land tax or cess, taxes or tolls on vehicles entering the village, entertainment tax or fees on cinemas or performances, various license fees for shops or trades, tax on non-agricultural land use, fees on the registration of cattle, specific taxes for services like sanitation, drainage, or conservancy, water rate or tax for providing drinking water, lighting rate or tax for streetlights, sometimes an education cess, and taxes or fees on fairs and festivals held within the village area.
That's actually quite a varied list of potential revenue sources, isn't it?
Right.
Property, professions, vehicles, entertainment, services.
The potential list is significant, yes. But the reality, as noted earlier by the ARC and reiterated in the source, is that very few Gram Panchayats across the country fully utilize these potential fiscal powers. The collection is often weak or non-existent for many of these taxes.
Okay, this brings us inevitably to the critical question that ties everything together. We've traced the evolution, seen the detailed constitutional framework, looked at the special case of PISA, and examined the financial underpinnings. Yet, despite decades of effort, constitutional status, and a clear mandate, the sources consistently indicate that the actual performance of Panchayati Raj institutions has often not been satisfactory and not up to the expected level. What are the key reasons the source lists for this persistent gap, this widespread suboptimal performance?
The source provides a pretty comprehensive and damning list of reasons identified over the years for this gap between the constitutional ideal and the reality on the ground. First, and arguably the most fundamental issue, is the lack of adequate devolution. Many state governments, despite the constitutional mandate, simply haven't sufficiently transferred the 3 Fs: functions, funds, and functionaries.
The 3 Fs, functions, funds, functionaries.
Exactly. While the 73rd Amendment listed those 29 functions in the 11th schedule, the actual transfer of genuine responsibility for these functions, the necessary financial resources, untied funds, to carry them out effectively, and the administrative and technical staff functionaries to manage them, has been seriously insufficient in many, if not most, states. The resources provided often don't come close to matching the responsibilities supposedly devolved on paper. Few states, the source notes, have fully implemented their own state finance commission's recommendations for financial devolution or taken concrete steps to ensure the long-term fiscal viability of panchayats.
So an incomplete transfer of power.
Fundamentally incomplete. Second, there's often excessive control by bureaucracy. In practice, in many states, the elected gram panchayats and other tiers are still heavily subordinated to the existing government administrative structures, particularly at the block and district levels. The source paints a picture where sarpanches, village chairpersons, often waste significant amounts of their time and energy just visiting block development offices simply to get funds released or obtain routine technical approvals for small projects. This dependency distorts their role away from being elected representatives responsive to their community towards becoming supplicants to the bureaucracy.
Undermining their elected status.
Precisely. Third, the tied nature of funds. As we discussed under finances, because such a large proportion of the grants flowing down are tied to specific schemes designed at the state or central level, often with rigid guidelines, the funded activities may not align with the most urgent or appropriate needs identified at the local village or block level through the Gram Sabha or Panchayat planning process. This mismatch can lead to unsuitable projects being pursued just because the money is available for that, or it can lead to funds remaining underspent because they don't fit the genuine local priorities.
Money available, but for the wrong things.
Effectively, yes. Fourth, an overwhelming dependency on government funding. This heavy reliance on external grants, mostly from the state and central governments, significantly reduces the internal incentive for panchayats to make the effort, the politically difficult effort, to generate their own resources through local taxation. Critically, this external dependency also diminishes public pressure for accountability and social audits. Why? Because the money is often perceived as coming from the government up above, rather than being our locally raised funds that people feel a stronger ownership over and right to scrutinize.
Less local ownership, less local demand for accountability.
That's the linkage. Fifth, relatedly, there's a widespread reluctance to use fiscal powers even where they exist. Despite being empowered by state laws to levy certain taxes, like property tax, profession tax, etc., very few gram panchayats actually do so effectively or consistently. The source explicitly mentions the common argument cited by panchayat leaders themselves. It's politically very difficult and unpopular to impose and collect taxes directly from your own neighbors and constituents, especially when you live among them in a close-knit community and need their votes again.
The social cost of taxing your own voters.
It's a real constraint. Sixth, the actual status and functioning of the Gram Sabha. While constitutionally mandated as the foundation of the system and envisioned as a potentially powerful tool for transparency, direct accountability, and participatory decision-making, especially for involving marginalized sections like women and lower castes, the reality is often disappointing. Many state panchayat acts have not clearly defined the specific powers, functions, and procedures of the Gram Sabha in enforceable detail. Crucially, there are often no clear consequences or penalties prescribed for government officials or elected panchayat members who ignore the Gram Sabha's decisions, fail to hold regular meetings properly, or don't present accounts and plans transparently. This lack of teeth significantly diminishes its potential effectiveness as a check and balance on the panchayat.
So the foundation is weak in practice.
Often, yes. Seventh, a persistent and problematic issue is the creation of parallel bodies, PBs. State governments or central ministries frequently set up separate project-specific committees or user groups for implementing particular development schemes, like water committees, education committees, watershed committees, etc., often arguing this is needed for speed, efficiency, or specialized management, supposedly bypassing the perceived weaknesses or slowness of the PIIs.
Bypassing the elected bodies.
Exactly. However, the source notes there is actually little hard evidence that these parallel bodies are inherently less prone to corruption, elite capture, or inefficiency than the PRIs themselves. The real damage they cause is that they systematically bypass and undermine the established, constitutionally mandated Panchayati Raj system. They create duplication, confusion, and often demoralize the elected PRIs by usurping their legitimate functional space and frequently having superior access to resources, training, and technical expertise provided under the specific scheme. They become competing power centers,
Fragmenting local governance.
and weakening the main structure. Eighth, poor infrastructure. This is a very practical but significant hurdle. Many gram panchayats, especially in poorer or more remote areas, lack the very basic resources needed for effective day-to-day functioning. This includes things like not having a full-time dedicated panchayat secretary, the key administrative support, not having a proper office building, lacking basic equipment like computers, or reliable databases necessary for proper planning, record-keeping, financial management, and monitoring of activities. How can you plan or manage effectively without these basics?
Can't function without basic tools.
Exactly.
And ninth, finally, limited training and capacity building for elected representatives. A significant number of the millions of elected Panchayat representatives across India, particularly in earlier years but still a relevant factor, are semi-literate or even illiterate. They often lack sufficient knowledge and understanding of their complex constitutional roles, their legal powers and responsibilities, the details of various government programs and schemes they're supposed to oversee, or the proper administrative and financial procedures they need to follow. Insufficient, inadequate, or poorly designed training programs prevent them from effectively performing the complex governance and development duties expected of them.
Lack of capacity to do the job.
Yes, a major bottleneck. Wow. That is a really clear and frankly quite stark breakdown of the obstacles. It's clearly not just one single thing, is it? It's a whole constellation of interconnected challenges, starting from that fundamental issue of inadequate devolution of the three Fs and the lack of real financial independence, compounded by practical matters like bureaucratic hurdles, the problem of tied funds, poor infrastructure, and the limited capacity of the representatives themselves, and then further complicated by systemic issues like the creation of parallel bodies undermining the system.
It really paints a complex picture.
It shows vividly how the constitutional framework, however well-intentioned and detailed, exists, but the supporting ecosystem, the political will for full empowerment, the administrative culture, the financial flows, the capacity building has often lagged significantly behind, preventing the system from reaching its full potential.
It really underscores that enacting a law, even a constitutional amendment as significant as the 73rd, is only the first step. The real success of a transformative system like Panchayati Raj hinges entirely on its actual implementation on the ground, the genuine devolution of real power and untied resources, a change in mindset from the state machinery to treat PRIs as partners, not subordinates, and crucially, the active engagement and vigilance of the citizens and communities it is meant to empower.
So let's bring it back to you, our listener. This whole system, Panchayati Raj, with all its history, its constitutional promise, and its very real challenges, it's ultimately designed to empower local communities and individuals like you. It's intended to provide a direct voice and a tangible role in your own development and governance, right down at the village or neighborhood level.
It holds that fundamental promise of truly bringing decision-making closer to the people it affects most directly, moving beyond just voting once every few years.
So reflecting on everything we've unpacked today, here's a final provocative thought for you to consider. Given the robust constitutional framework that is in place, thanks to the 73rd Amendment and PISA, and acknowledging the persistent, well-documented challenges we've discussed, the lack of three Fs, the bureaucratic control, the financial constraints, the sometimes weak gram sabhas, what concrete actions, perhaps going beyond just top-down policy changes, might truly bridge that gap between the constitutional ideal of Panchayati Raj and its current, often suboptimal reality.
What could make a difference?
What specific role can things like increased community awareness, more active and informed participation in Gram Sabha meetings, stronger local leadership, and persistent demands for transparency and accountability from the ground level up play in making Panchayati Raj the vibrant embodiment of direct democracy it was originally envisioned to be?
Really think about what it would take, practically, for that original vision to be fully realized in your own community or communities you know. What needs to change?
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into India's complex and vital Panchayati Raj system.
We really hope the insights we've extracted today from the sources you provided encourage you to explore this incredibly important topic further. It affects the lives of hundreds of millions of people every day,